Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take another look at one of my older reviews and bring them up to my more current quality standards. Today we'll be taking another look at Empire Earth along with its expansion pack, The Art of Conquest, for PC. This real-time strategy game, developed by Stainless Steel Studios and published by Sierra in 2001 for PC exclusively, was followed up by its expansion pack, which was actually developed by Mad Dog Software in 2002. They would later go on to develop the rest of the games in the series, except for Empire's Dawn of the Modern World, which was already being worked on by Stainless Steel, while Mad Dog was working on the expansion pack for Empire Earth 1. Now, it's worth noting a few things before we get into the meat of this review. First off, this project was spearheaded by Rick Goodman. He was the lead designer of the original Age of Empires, although he left the company before they made Age of Empires 2. As a result, this game is very often compared to Age of Empires. It has a very similar theme, a lot of the mechanics are very similar, so it's pretty easy to compare the two. Although this one is considerably more ambitious in scope. Second thing to note, this thing did receive pretty decent reviews, although it was certainly not reviewed as highly as the Age of Empires series. There is a reason for that, which I will get to in a moment. But continuing the discussion of how this was received in its day, the Art of Conquest expansion was considerably less well received than the base game. In fact, it was not very well received at all. It was generally seen as a very lackluster at best expansion pack that didn't add enough to the game to justify its asking price. And the final thing to note is that one of the more celebrated features of the game was the multiplayer, which you pretty much can't play anymore unless you go over local network. Obviously, there are third-party solutions, but the official servers have been shut down since 2008, so it's not particularly easy to go hopping into an online game anymore. So with all that in mind, let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out whether we're looking at the second coming of Age of Empires or something else entirely. Well, before we really get into the meat of the game, let's first talk about the presentation, which for its time was actually rather advanced. This is because it was one of the relatively early examples of a full 3D real-time strategy game. Of course, that means that by modern standards, it looks positively archaic. I mean, you got extremely low-res, very blocky models, you got very low-res textures. You don't really have a lot of environmental effects or anything of that nature. What you do have, however, is a full 3D real-time strategy game in an era where that was becoming a thing. This does come with a few problems, though. For one, the zoom factor is very, very low. It was designed for 4:3 resolutions, and even on those, it was zoomed in quite a bit. And that zoom factor is retained at higher resolutions like what you're seeing in this video, which is 1080p. In addition, I've noticed some odd stability issues with the expansion pack. You see, if you want to access any of the expansion pack content, then you have to specifically start up the expansion pack, and it won't even start up. The only operating system I've ever managed to consistently get the expansion pack working on is Windows XP. On Windows 7, it has been very iffy. It never worked on the 64-bit, and it barely worked on the 32-bit. And of course, anything newer than Windows 7, it is a total crapshoot. I've never managed to get the expansion pack working on my Windows 10 installation either, and I'm really not sure what causes this problem, so it's pretty much impossible to fix it. I've tried everything I can possibly think of. I've updated drivers, I've degraded drivers, I have reinstalled the game numerous times, I've run it in every conceivable combination of compatibility mode and running in administrator, so on and so forth. It just crashes immediately on startup. And I have seen some people claim that the DRM causes this issue, but I'm running the GOG version which had the DRM removed, so that shouldn't be a problem. But what really gets me about it is that the base game works just fine, but the expansion pack won't, and I have no idea what causes it or how to fix it. As a result, almost the entirety of the footage you'll be seeing in this review is of the base game. I will include some footage of Art of Conquest in the later portion of the video when I actually talk about the expansion pack, but you are going to notice that it's not at the same quality level as the main footage that you'll be seeing throughout this review because it was recorded at 720p instead of 1080p, because the computer that I have set up that I can actually run it is at 1280 by 720. Plus, there are a lot of weird graphics glitches that popped up with that particular footage, so you'll just have to bear with me on that. I did what I could with what I had, but unfortunately the game just doesn't want to work on modern operating systems, especially ones that are 64-bit. Well, the expansion pack anyway, which is actually kind of baffling because technically it's not really any different from the base game. They did tweak a few things here and there, and they did introduce a few new units and a few new buildings and such for the new space age that they put in. But beyond that, they didn't really change all that much. Which would imply that there's something deeper in the code that is causing the issue rather than simply the presentation. And moving on from the visuals and the engine side of things as far as presentation goes, you get into the sound design, which is, well, rather weak, actually. It's actually hard to believe that this came from the same lead designer as the original Age of Empires, because the soundtrack especially is infinitely better in the entire Age of Empires series. In this, it is dull and monotonous. The only track that really stands out is the main menu theme, and even it's not very good. All the other music is so repetitive and bland that it'll probably put you to sleep. The sound effects really aren't very strong either. There's quite a lot of stock sounds in there, and it's very noticeable. This ultimately means that while the sound effects are not outright awful, they're just not very interesting. There's nothing in there that really stands out from the crowd, because you've heard those sound effects before, and they were better the first time around. But I think what gets me the most is the voice acting, which is actually quite terrible. All of the accents are ridiculously over-exaggerated, and it's to the point where if you didn't know it was because of sheer incompetence, it would almost sound racist. By the time Empire Earth came out, real-time strategy games had had voices for a while, and it had been done several times better than that in previous games. So when you bring everything together, you have a real shame in the sound department where everything is just a mess, and then you go over to the visuals, and while it was certainly technically impressive for its time, it has aged very poorly, and it looks positively archaic by modern standards. Not to mention the engine instability problems that the expansion pack especially has. But DW, you're rambling too much about presentation. You're right, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is split into several campaigns. In the base game you have the Greek, English, Russian, and German campaigns, each of which takes place in several different eras, and in the expansion pack you have the Roman, Pacific, and Asian campaigns. Each of these campaigns is self-contained, meaning that the story doesn't affect anything going on in other campaigns. Most of them are historical campaigns, the Greek, English, and German campaigns in the base game, and the Roman and Pacific campaigns in the expansion pack. But then there are two additional campaigns, the Asian and the Russian campaigns, that are set in the future, and thus every single thing in them is completely fictional. And while the writing in the historical campaigns is not particularly good, and you have some dialogue that is often very much cringe-inducing, the futuristic campaigns are a whole other ballgame, because they try to act complicated and interesting when in reality they are just kind of jumbled messes that the writing team threw together based on rule of cool more than anything else. And I think it's worth noting that if you're going to make a game like this, and you're going to treat it pretty seriously, it's incredibly stupid to try to put things like time travel in there, because that's always going to be ridiculously corny. The thing is, you can really tell that while they did put adequate effort into making them playable campaigns, the campaigns themselves are really not the main focus of the game. The writing is not very good, and when you actually play them, they're just bog standard from a gameplay standpoint. There is absolutely nothing in any of the campaigns that you haven't seen in several other real-time strategy games going back to the mid-90s. Whether it be Age of Empires, StarCraft, Warcraft, Command & Conquer, really you name it, and you've probably played these campaigns before, but done better. That's not to say that the campaigns are bad, but it really does seem like they designed them purely out of obligation rather than any real interest in them. And the campaigns do suffer as a result. This means that pretty much the entirety of this game falls to the gameplay to bring things up, and that is where things do get somewhat interesting. Unlike in, say, Age of Empires, where you have 4 distinct ages that you go through, in this one you actually have 14 different epics that you go through, or 15 if you count the one that's included in the Art of Conquest expansion. These go from the Prehistoric Age all the way up to the Nano Age in the base game, and the Space Age in Art of Conquest. With each new epic comes new technologies that will of course improve your economy, but also give you access to new units, to new buildings, etc. And on the one hand, it is certainly very cool that you can go all the way from the prehistoric era up to using robots and lasers and things like that. But then reality sets in, and you actually play the game, and the epics are really not as well thought out as you might hope they are. Several of the epics barely have any advances whatsoever, and might as well just have been removed from the game entirely. This has the side effect of making the game one of the most unbelievably sluggish real-time strategy games you will ever play. Unless your game starts in the Middle Ages at the very least, you are going to be spending most of your time just building up economy that takes absolutely forever and barely gets you any resources. And resource production is still ridiculously slow even in the Middle Ages, but at least by that point you have a good variety of units to mess around with. If you decide to start in the Prehistoric Age, you actually only have access to 6 units in total. You have basically no options whatsoever, which of course does make sense. I mean, it is the Prehistoric Age. But you don't really get a good variety of units until the Bronze Age, which is 4 epochs into the game. And even the variety of units in the Bronze Age is pretty minimal. Of course, if you decide to start in the Prehistoric Age, you're going to find that it's going to take you absolutely forever to get to that point. To give you an example, I set up an experiment to see how long it took me to get from the Prehistoric Age up to just the Copper Age, let alone the Bronze Age. And doing nothing but going full economy and trying to get as many resources as possible in order to be able to go up in the epics as quickly as possible, it took me 25 minutes. That is 25 minutes of absolutely nothing but focusing all efforts on resource production. And there are 5 different resources in the game: food, wood, gold, stone, and iron. And with the stone, gold, and iron in particular, it is unbelievably slow to produce because you can only have 6 workers on a mine at any given point. At least with food, you have multiple ways of producing it, many of which are quicker than simply gathering from a forage point, which is like the mines in that you can only have 6 workers on a forage point at any given time. But you have more options. You can have people hunting, you can have people fishing, you can have people producing food at farms once those become available. And wood you don't even have to worry about at all because you can have pretty much anybody collecting wood, so at least that's a resource that's going to be plentiful. But everything else takes a really long time to produce, and as a result, the early game especially is ridiculously slow-paced. One of the steps they could have taken to help reduce this issue is to actually combine several of the epics. As it stands, they've got several epics that are not much more than placeholders until you get to the next epic beyond that. What I think they really should have done with it is combine the Prehistoric and Stone Ages into one, combine Copper, Bronze, and Dark Ages into one, and combine the Imperial and Industrial Ages into one. Then you wouldn't have so many minimal changes between epics, and you'd end up with something a lot more cohesive as a result. Not to mention it'd also go along more quickly because then you'd have access to more technologies to be able to improve the economy and such. So sluggish economy and the fact that there are too many epics that are kind of superfluous aside, what about the actual unit balancing and such? Well, every unit does have its own hard counters. So, for example, cavalry is hard countered by spears and pikemen. Fighters and anti-air emplacements are very good at taking down enemy aircraft. Tanks and such are very easily taken down by anti-tank weapons. Archers are good at taking out most infantry, and so on and so forth. There are a few issues with it, though. First off is an interface problem. None of the units are well described in the game when you're trying to train them or when you're selecting them or anything of that nature. All the game will tell you when you're trying to train the units is what they cost in terms of resources and population count. So if you want to know what the unit actually does, then you're going to need to consult a guide or consult the unit tree or something of that nature to get a rough idea of what it's going to be good against versus what it's going to be weak against. Or, of course, you could just figure it out through basic trial and error, but it still is a problem that the game needed to fix. Because you gotta remember that by the time this came out, Age of Empires 2 had been out for 2 years. And it featured detailed descriptions of what every single technology and every single unit did. It was immensely helpful to have that information available. There is absolutely no downside whatsoever to giving the player more information to be able to do what they need to do. Empire Earth, on the other hand, seemed to think that it was perfectly acceptable to have Age of Empires 1 levels of primitiveness. Well, that might have been acceptable in the mid-90s, but in 2001 it was no longer acceptable. This ultimately means that Empire Earth is really not a very accessible real-time strategy game. On top of the ridiculously sluggish pace, it just doesn't really give the player enough information for them to be able to easily adjust to it. But apart from simply an accessibility problem, this also highlights a major issue with the way the units are designed. Every single unit in this game is a hard counter. It is specifically good against one other type of unit, and anything else is going to have severely reduced damage against it. For example, archers are very powerful against infantry. If you use them against cavalry, then they almost do no damage at all, and if you use them against archers, they do significantly reduced damage to what you would be expecting from infantry. But it's not simply the archers that are like that. Every single unit in the game is like that. It has one particular unit type that it is really good against, another unit type that it's not terrible against, and every other unit type it's just terrible against. It ends up being a game that is centered almost entirely around severe rock, paper, scissors. There's almost no versatility to the units whatsoever. Compound that with the fact that the AI cheats and churns out an absolutely absurd number of units of various types, and you end up with a game that ultimately results in battles of attrition every single game. Now, of course, if you're playing against other players, then that can change up a bit, but at least when you're playing against the AI, it is always a battle of attrition, and it's not remotely uncommon for those games to take upwards of 2 hours to complete. Sometimes even more than that, and that's when you know that for a real-time strategy game, they have just completely borked the pacing. It's fairly unusual for a match in a real-time strategy game to last longer than about 45 minutes. It's even weirder for it to last longer than an hour, unless you have a couple of players really going at it, or you have a lot of players in a match. But like I said, it's not remotely uncommon for matches to last upwards of 2 hours or more in Empire Earth. And that's precisely because the economy is so ridiculously sluggish in this game, and every single match just devolves into a battle of attrition. You see, unlike in a game like, say, Age of Empires, you never really run out of resources, it just takes forever to harvest them. This basically means that as long as you can harvest the resources, you can put up a fight, which means that everything is going to take absolutely forever to complete, especially considering that pretty much everybody spams towers and anti-air defenses. There's no real line breaker units you can rely on. There's nothing that can really push into an enemy's territory and clear a path for your army to advance. Instead, you basically have to rely on your artillery to be able to take out entrenched enemy positions, and then you just have to have a ridiculous number of troops in order to be able to conquer anything. I mean, you really can't even rely on atomic weapons to break the siege because they, oddly enough, don't do that much damage. Oh sure, they'll wipe out large swaths of units in a very small radius, but they barely take out any structures, if any at all. I've seen it take at least 3 to take out a single tower, which is pretty freaking ridiculous. So with the lack of any real line breaker units, it just comes down to massive hordes of units going up against each other in protracted battles of attrition, and eventually someone's economy will win out over the other. This means that most of the gameplay ends up being extremely tedious, because you're just sitting there wailing on each other for a very long period of time without much end in sight. I mean, that's not to say that there aren't interesting features. For example, there is a civilization customizer, where you can make your own custom civilizations with their own sets of abilities. The only problem with that being that all of the abilities that I speak of are passive bonuses, like 20% less production costs, or 15% more attack power. But unfortunately, all of the civilizations are just combinations of these passive bonuses. There are no unique units in the base game whatsoever, and they're barely even in the expansion pack. You can get access to a cyber ninja or an SAS commando, and that's pretty much it. And those are handled exactly the same way that all of the other bonuses are, so it's just a matter of setting up a civilization to be whatever you want it to be, and whatever you feel like your own specific playstyle is. So if you want to gear up for cavalry production or infantry production or whatever it may well be, then you can certainly do that. The problem is that you can also phase yourself into obsolescence, because certain unit types are only available in certain epochs, and if you go past those epochs or are before those epochs, then you can't use those units, and thus the bonuses don't even apply to you. Thus you end up in a situation where it's really advantageous to set up the game to be a specific set of eras where you can have a series of civilizations that work well within those eras, instead of just having to start at the prehistoric age, pick whatever suits your fancy, and then go from there and hope that you actually get to the point where you can actually use those abilities. This ultimately means that while the custom civilization idea is certainly interesting, the implementation of it here is pretty messy. In fact, that's ultimately how I would describe Empire Earth in general, including the Art of Conquest expansion. Some interesting ideas, but ultimately the implementation is way too messy for it to actually work well. I mean, even the space age that they introduce in the Art of Conquest is not handled particularly well. They basically added in a few new units for the space age for you to mess around with on the ground, and they introduced the idea of space, which instead of being anything particularly interesting, unfortunately acts more like an ocean than anything else. You build a space dock, which you use to build spaceships, which might as well just be boats, and you can transport units across the planets much like you can with the open seas in the base game. Oh, and you really only get 5 spaceships to play around with, one of which is docked on the space carriers, which are basically the space equivalent of aircraft carriers. To say the space age is disappointing is a pretty big understatement. But that's really the entire game in a nutshell. It has a few decent ideas here and there, but none of them really pan out, and what you end up with is a big disappointment. Even something like the morale mechanic is not handled particularly well. It's supposed to be an idea of your units having morale, and if they don't have morale, that's a bad thing, but all it really amounts to is you get a defensive bonus. And if your units aren't close enough to a structure or a hero that provides morale, then they just don't get that defensive bonus. It's a real shame, because you could see where they were trying to make this the next evolution of the Age of Empires style of play, but unfortunately they just didn't really do enough with it successfully. You end up with a very weak base game that has an even weaker expansion pack, and I can see very easily why people thought that the Art of Conquest expansion wasn't really worth the asking price. Now that's not to say that the game doesn't have potential. Even though this one is a mess, you can see where they could improve things in the sequels. And they did produce 2 sequels, which I will be taking a look at eventually. But this video is about Empire Earth and the Art of Conquest expansion. Now as far as the base game goes, I give it a 2 out of 5. It's a rather weak base game that could have been improved by the expansion pack, but unfortunately they didn't improve it, and you end up with this incredibly sluggish, tedious, ultimately mind-numbingly boring real-time strategy game as a result. The expansion pack, The Art of Conquest, on the other hand, is a different monster entirely, because you not only have the fact that it's a pretty bad expansion pack that doesn't really add enough to the game to justify its original asking price, and even if you bundle it with the game, it doesn't really add enough to justify its inclusion. But on top of that, The Art of Conquest just doesn't work on anything except 32-bit operating systems unless you just get insanely lucky. Obviously that's a problem that's more in hindsight than anything else, because they didn't really anticipate people playing this many years later on 64-bit operating systems, but it is something to factor in nonetheless. This means that while the expansion pack does earn the 1.5 out of 5 that I give it on its own faults, ultimately, the fact that it doesn't work on modern operating systems just solidifies that. And when you bring everything together, the original Empire Earth just ends up being a tedious slog of a real-time strategy game that had a ton of potential, but it just didn't deliver on any of it. We'll see if they manage to improve this with the sequels, but we'll get there when we get there. Until then, thanks for watching.